This is Nauru, and it was once known as the world's richest country according to GDP. Over the years, the country's economy has crumbled, making that title obsolete. How does the wealthiest country in the world go from riches back to rags? Nauru is a tiny island that is 1/10 the size of Washington, D.C., often referred to as the smallest island nation. Located in the Pacific Ocean around 42 kilometers south of the equator and 3,000 kilometers northeast of Australia, Nauru is a relatively isolated country with a population of just over 12,000. Although the island was initially sighted in 1798, it was only seen as a place of beauty. With its white sand beaches and swaying palms, Nauru was given the name Pleasant Island, and was disregarded as anything more than a sightseeing destination. That is, until 1899, when geologist Albert Ellis discovered the true treasure that was hidden within the island. The rock-like objects that had been spotted around the island had turned out to be high-grade phosphate ore, which is equivalent to a fortune in the world of trade. Phosphate rock contains high concentrations of phosphate compounds that can be utilized in the creation of fertilizer and is an essential part of agriculture. Since phosphate provides so many benefits to the farming industry, it is a highly coveted resource. Albert Ellis knew that he had to get his hands on the source. He sailed back to Nauru in 1901 and found out that around 80% of the entire island's topside, which is the raised central plateau that part of the island rests on, was filled with phosphate of lime. Since most native Naururans chose to live closer to the shoreline, the topside was mostly uninhabited. One of the companies in Nauru, the Pacific Islands Company, completely rebranded to the Pacific Phosphate Company and decided to capitalize solely off of this discovery of phosphate. During this time, Nauru was under German control as part of German New Guinea. By 1905, the Pacific Phosphate Company had already entered into a lucrative partnership with Germany to mine the phosphate deposits, marking the beginning of a new, prosperous era for the island of Nauru. Just 1 year after the deal was struck, the first shipload of phosphate out of Nauru was ready to set sail. However, it would find itself lost at sea off of the coast of Australia after an intense storm. Although the country's first experience with phosphate exports didn't leave the best first impression, it knew that phosphate was highly valuable and that no matter what had to be done, they would master the mining and export of this precious mineral. The once luscious topside was rid completely of all its plants and animal life, and the Pacific Phosphate Company worked tirelessly to extract as much phosphate as possible. When World War I began in 1914, the economy declined significantly, with Germany away at war. By the time it was all over, Australia had gained rule of Nauru due to capturing it from Germany. Knowing the profit potential of the island's phosphate industry, Australia funneled endless capital into infrastructure improvements, technology, and mining developments to increase production numbers and exports. Nauru started exporting around 200 metric tons of phosphate for the first few years, then ramping up to 4 times that number in the years after that. At this time, Australia was pricing the exports much lower than the world average to the League of Nations mandated British Phosphate Commissioners, which consisted of Australia, Great Britain and New Zealand. In 1942, the island of Nauru would descend into a period of suffering due to Japanese occupation. Japanese soldiers were throwing Naururans into forced labour camps, inflicting torture and committing mass drownings of the people. The island was also the victim to multiple air attacks from American bombers for 2 years under Japanese occupation. Australian troops were finally able to retake control of Nauru from the Japanese in 1946. By this point, there were less than 600 surviving Naururans on the island. Nauru was then granted a trusteeship under Australia, Britain and New Zealand under the United Nations, and operations of phosphate mining slowly started back up again. It didn't take long to revive the phosphate industry, and exports soared to never-before-seen numbers. Australian and New Zealand farmers were still benefiting from the discounted, below-market prices up until 1963. However, during this time, Nauru was already making independence of their nation a top priority. In 1968, Nauru finally became an independent nation. With most of the workforce being specialized phosphate miners, it didn't take long for Nauru to establish itself as one of the strongest economies. At this point, over 35 million metric tons of phosphate had been exported under the administration of other nations. But Nauru made that number look like child's play when it finally started producing its own. By the late 1900s, 80 million metric tons of phosphate had been exported, growing the tiny island's economy from nothing to one of the most prosperous in the entire world. Although the country was benefiting from the wealth of its thriving phosphate industry, it sacrificed the island's land as a result. When the 1960s rolled around, Naururans were forced to live on a narrow ring around the overmined plateau of rough coral and limestone pillars. The degradation of the environment turned a once beautiful pleasure island into nothing but strip-mined, rough terrain. Despite these clear signs of environmental strain, the government of Nauru continued to overmine phosphate deposits for the sake of economic gain. In 1975, Nauru's Phosphate Royalties Trust was valued at over $1 billion Australian dollars, and in 1981, the nation had a GDP per capita of $27,000 US, or over $90,000 today. Once Nauru had a taste of wealth, they couldn't stop wanting more. Their corporate greed overcame them, and they overexerted their natural resources to the point of no return. Despite having an abundance of phosphate deposits, Nauru was left with empty pockets after extensive overmining. The environment suffered severely as a result, depleting the island of its most valuable natural resource. Around this time, Nauru was also looking to offset their phosphate losses by seeking compensation from Australia, New Zealand and Britain for the environmental damage done to the island due to their controlled mining efforts. At first, Australia refused to pay, and instead proposed a citizenship deal for Naururans looking to resettle in Australia. It wasn't until 1989, when Nauru took Australia to the International Court of Justice, did Australia cave and pay a settlement of 57 million Australian dollars. That payment would come in 1994, and another 50 million Australian dollars would be paid throughout the next 20 years. By the 1990s, Nauru was becoming painfully aware that their phosphate deposits were finite. In an attempt to diversify the economy and maintain its success, Nauru attempted other industry efforts such as offshore banking and entertainment, in hopes of having a sustainable economy long term. However, this shift in focus came with a few pitfalls. The Nauruan government was unequipped to make proper financial decisions, and ultimately sent their country into a downward spiral with incompetent strategy. In 1993, the Nauruan government funded a musical called Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love, which turned out to be a colossal failure. What prompted the investment decision, you may ask? The Nauruan president's one-time meeting with Unit 4+2 singer Tommy Muller. The opening night was held at the London Theatre and is still considered one of the most disastrous productions in all of theatre history, with scathing reviews and a loss of what would be almost $9 million today. As for the banking industry, there were no requirements to visit Nauru to open an offshore bank on the island, and bank records weren't even required to be kept. Corruption seeped into the Nauruan government, with loans being left unpaid and blind eyes being turned. This left plenty of room for under-the-table illegal activities to be funneled through this broken system. Along with this, Nauru also tried to explore options such as offering economic citizenships, diplomatic passports, and other licenses. Although this method did earn the economy several $1 million, it also gave wiggle room for money laundering and tax evasion, resulting in billions of dollars in criminal money coming in and out of the economy throughout the 90s. These actions earned Nauru a designation as a money laundering state by the US Treasury in 2002. Nauru turned to the most desperate of measures during their economic plummet, establishing an agreement with Australia in 2001 to house a detention centre for asylum seekers to Australia. The Australian government paid Nauru millions in processing and aid fees, but this couldn't even compare to a fraction of what the phosphate industry had made. By 2004, the phosphate industry was truly at an end, with only 22,000 metric tons exported. With this also came the end of Nauru's economic prosperity, leaving the country dirt broke and in shambles. In urgent need of guidance and financial assistance, Nauru once again partnered with Australia over the management of the country's wealth, or lack thereof. The island had removed the sketchy offshore banks in an attempt to regain some sort of economic stability. Currently, Australia is moving the last few refugees from its offshore detention centre in Nauru. The nation is making small improvements from its shattered state, sitting at a $133.2 million GDP in 2021. The country continues to receive Australian aid and is a ghost of what it once was. Many Nauruans have expressed the same sentiment that they wish they had never discovered phosphate, because all that is left of the island now is dirt and rock, with nothing else to show for it. This is a prime example of how greed can overpower all rationale, turning something with seemingly endless potential into ashes. Meanwhile, Nauru's main partner, Australia, is thriving after taking advantage of the island's resources. If you want to learn more about how Australia's economy is doing today, check out our last video, How Did Australia Get So Rich?